Today, I'll be walking through the entire DJI GO 4 application so that I can explain what all the different settings and icons mean. The first thing I want to cover is the icons on the home screen, which can be very overwhelming, especially to those who are new to flying DJI drones. To organize this a little bit, I want to start in the top left corner with the DJI logo and work my way across the right side of the screen and then down. To help follow along, I'll provide a small arrow to point out what I'm explaining. Anyway, getting into it, the DJI logo in the top left corner will bring you back to the menu screen where you can switch drones, access the editor, etc, etc. Next to that is the status indicator, which will display the state of the drone. The background will change between three different colors: green, yellow, and red. Green means you are good to fly as normal, yellow means you are still good to fly, although with some kind of warning, and red means that you cannot fly. To get more information, you can tap on the status indicator to get a detailed look at the state of each individual internal component, such as the IMU, ESCs, and compass. There's some other vital information that can be found here, and is good to look over before you fly. Moving to the top right corner of the screen, we have 6 different icons that are arguably some of the most important to look at during your flight. The first one is a quadcopter icon, which displays the flight mode that you are currently in. So for example, I am in P or standard mode, and when I switch to sport mode and then ATTI mode, it is reflected beside the little icon. Next to that is the satellite icon, which represents how many satellites are connected to your drone to determine its GPS location. It also shows the connection strength. Next is a pretty basic circle logo, which represents the status of the obstacle avoidance sensors. It's pretty simple. White means they are on, and red means they are turned off. So for example, obstacle avoidance is disabled in sport mode, so when we flip our drone into sport mode, the icon will turn red. Moving on, the next icon is a remote and displays the connection strength between the controller and drone. This is important to keep an eye on at all times so that your aircraft does not come disconnected if you fly too far away. Next to that is a logo with the letters HD that displays the connection strength of the image quality being sent back to your mobile device. It also will have the numbers 2.4 or 5.8 displayed above. It all depends on which frequency you choose in your image transmission settings. The final icon on this row displays your remaining battery life. Before we move on, the 3 dots in the top right corner will take us into the various different menu settings, which I'll go through after I'm done going through everything on the home screen. Underneath of this top bar is a thin line that represents the battery life in a different way. Rather than showing the percentage left, it shows the estimated flight time remaining so that we can get a rough estimate of how long that we can fly for. Moving down again, we have all of our important camera values that can be viewed at a glance rather than opening the full camera settings. These are ISO, shutter speed, aperture, exposure value, and white balance. Next to that longest box is 2 pieces of information about the SD card. One is the format that you are shooting in, and the other is the remaining capacity on the card that you've inserted. Beside the SD card information is a green box that can be tapped to switch between focusing and exposure metering. When the icon is a green box, we can tap around the screen to set our focus. When the icon is a yellow circle, we can tap around the screen to adjust the exposure value to properly match the specific area that we've selected. I usually never mess with the exposure metering because I'm always using the manual camera settings. Next is AF/MF, which allows you to choose between autofocus and manual focus. With autofocus selected, we can tap around the screen and let the camera do the work for us. When manual focus is selected, we can adjust the focus using the slider along the right side of the screen. Finally, the AE with a lock symbol stands for auto exposure lock. Typically, with automatic camera settings, it will continue to shift to reach your desired exposure value. This can sometimes ruin your footage, so by turning auto exposure lock on, it will lock the camera settings and not compensate for change. Now heading to the left side of the screen, we first have the auto takeoff button. Tapping this and sliding to the right will prime the motors and fly the drone up to a hover at around 4 feet. Under that is the return to home button, which will automatically send the drone back to its set home point. The third and final icon will show us a list of all intelligent flight modes, such as point of interest, tripod mode, and many others. Moving over to the right side of the screen, we have some of our basic camera controls. The first icon that features 2 arrows pointing around in a circle allows you to switch between photo and video mode. If you want to take a picture or video, we will use the shutter button directly under that. An easy way to tell whether you are in photo or video mode is to look at the color of this shutter button. Red means video mode and white means photo mode. Underneath of the shutter button is an icon that allows you to access all of your other camera settings, which we'll be going over in just a minute once we wrap up the home screen. The final little icon that we have on the right side of the screen is a play button that shows us all the files on our SD card. From here, we can just preview them or download them directly to our device. Turning our attention to the bottom left corner of the screen, we can view some of our flight telemetry. The big circle figure is a compass that will show you which way you are looking relative to north. You'll notice that if you spin the remote controller around, the small red triangle will move with you. Next to that is a collection of numbers that relay the in-flight telemetry. D stands for distance, H stands for height, HS stands for horizontal speed, VS stands for vertical speed, and VPS stands for visual positioning system. The final icon on the screen is the map in the bottom right corner. I have this hidden so I won't give away my personal address, but it's fairly easy to use during flight and easy to navigate. Now that we've gone over all the icons on the home screen, it is time to walk through the camera settings, which again can be found by tapping the icon that has 3 lines just underneath of the shutter button. This group of settings is comprised of 3 tabs, the first of which deals with exposure value. We first have the option to choose between automatic camera settings, aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual. Automatic will set ISO, shutter speed, and aperture automatically to achieve the desired exposure value. Aperture priority allows you to set the aperture to your desired value, and then ISO and shutter speed are set automatically. Shutter speed priority, on the other hand, is the same concept, although you get to set your desired shutter speed value. And finally, manual will allow you to set all of your values to properly expose your photos and videos. The next tab deals with file types and formats. First up is video size, which allows you to change the resolution and frame rate of your video. I typically always shoot in a resolution of 4K, but there are plenty of other options to choose from. Next is video format. We can choose between .mov and .mp4. This is basically just what type of file you want your videos to come out in. A simple rule of thumb for this is to choose .mov when editing on a Mac and .mp4 when editing on a PC. These would be the most compatible file formats for their respective system. Under file format is NTSC/PAL, which has to do with broadcasting. Again, simple rule of thumb, if you're in North America, you will use NTSC, and if you reside in Europe, you will use PAL. This essentially has to do with how many frames are transmitted per second. Next up, we have white balance, which ensures your colors look realistic. You can get by with using auto white balance, but this can make color correction in post quite an annoying project. I typically like to shoot in either sunny or cloudy depending on the weather outside, and then leave it be for the rest of the day. Moving on, we have our style settings, which will let us tweak the contrast, saturation, and sharpness settings of our drone. This is all about personal preference. I typically shoot in standard with 0 values across the board. I'll do the adjusting if I need any in my editing software once I look back at the footage. After the style settings, we've got color, which is essentially choosing the color profile that you want to shoot in. Like style, this is all about personal preference, and you can play around and see which one of these you like best. The final setting on this tab is camera video coding. This deals with the compression of the video that you shoot. H.265 is a bit more efficient, but is sometimes harder to edit on your computer with certain programs. I would stick to H.264. Now, moving on to the third and final tab, we have a bunch of miscellaneous camera settings that will aid you in taking better videos and pictures. First is histogram, which is this draggable box on the home screen that allows you to monitor your exposure value. If the range is further to the left, then it's too dark, and if it's further to the right, then it's too bright. Using this will effectively help you manage your exposure value. Next is front LEDs auto turn off. When selected, this will turn off the 2 front LEDs when taking a picture or video, and then they'll turn right back on once you're finished. Lock gimbal when captured will aid you in taking more stable images when turned on. Enable AFC mode will allow you to keep your shot in focus by continuously refocusing your camera for you. In fact, AFC stands for autofocus continuous. Next is overexposure warning, which adds a zebra pattern to areas that may be too overexposed, or in other words, too bright. This can be very helpful, but I usually leave it off because it just gets in the way. Moving on to mechanical shutter, when turning this on, it will help eliminate rolling shutter, which at times will distort your images with moving objects. Video caption obviously adds a caption to your video, and now AF and MF focus assistant. Essentially, what you would do when these are turned on is you would tap on the screen to autofocus, or you'd slide on the screen to actually, set your manual focus, and it would blow the image up to help you fine-tune your focus. Moving on to grid, this will add grid lines to our screen to aid you in lining up your shot. Center points does essentially the same thing, although rather than adding lines, it adds a center marker on your screen. Next up is anti-flicker, which will keep the artificial light from the light bulbs from blinking when you record them. 60 Hz is for the United States, while 50 Hz is for Europe, so just like with NTSC/PAL, remember to set these accordingly depending on where you'll be shooting. After anti-flicker, we have file index mode, and you can have the option of either reset or continuous. Reset will start the names of your files back over at 1, while continuous will never reset the number and will always increase even if you format the SD card. So let me give you a quick example. Let's you head out, you shoot 3 pictures. Those file names are DJI 0001, 0002, and 003. And then from there, let's say you have continuous on, you go put the files on your computer, delete your SD card, plug it back into your drone. Once you start shooting again, it's going to go 004, 005, 006. But from there, if you guys had reset turned on, then those file names would totally reset. In my opinion, I would recommend using continuous. So if you go and just dump all your files on your desktop, clear your SD card, and then go and dump your files again, you could accidentally overwrite some files if you have reset turned on. Next is focus peaking threshold, which adds a red outline to everything in your shot that is in focus. You can choose how strict the threshold is, but I typically like to use high so that there isn't a bunch of red all over my screen. Finally, we have camera settings, which allows you to set up camera profiles to jump around to so you don't have to spend even more time changing all of your settings. Now that we're done with the camera settings, it is time to jump into the general settings, which can be accessed by tapping on the 3 dots in the top right corner. First up is our measurement units, which I have set to imperial, as that is what I grew up learning, but if you prefer the metric system, you have that option as well. Under that, we have yet another camera setting, which allows us to choose what the long press action on the home screen does. With gimbal control set, we can move the gimbal up and down by long pressing on the home screen with one finger. I typically like using this rather than focus, as I can already focus the camera if I need to by just tapping on the screen. Next up is select live broadcast program, and there is no settings involved here. Moving on, we have some map settings. First is show flight route, so essentially, if you pull up the map, it will leave a transparent trail where your drone has flown. Next is cache map in the background, which stores the loaded map on your mobile device so that you don't have to use data to load it at a later date. This is a good setting to keep on if you're in an area with spotty service. Getting back to that flight route, if you want to remove it from your map, you can tap on clear flight route. The final map setting is unlocking list, which will show you a list of locations that you've submitted NFZ tokens to fly in. Next up, we have our video cache setting, which essentially stores a lower resolution version of all photos and videos taken on the mobile device itself. We can choose our maximum capacity, so this is anywhere between 2 GB to 16 GB, and we can also choose whether we want the cache to be cleared automatically when it is filled. Finally, we can choose if we want the audio from our mobile device to be recorded along with the flight video when you watch it back, or when you watch that cached video back on your mobile device. If you want to clear your cached video to clear up some space on your phone, you can do so by tapping clear video cache. Finally, at the bottom, we have some miscellaneous settings. So first, we can see a list of previous warnings from our flights. We can also see the device name of the current drone that we are flying, and we can also see a little bit about the drone there at the bottom. The one thing I skipped over is the full screen setting. So a little secret, actually, of the DJI GO app is that if you guys want to get rid of the icons on the home screen, you can swipe up or down with one finger to make them disappear, and then swipe again up or down to bring them back. You can change this to 2 fingers if you want, which I actually prefer because sometimes it will accidentally trigger when I drag my hand across the screen. The next settings menu that we have is the gimbal settings. So first, we can choose our gimbal mode. FPV will give you an FPV-like flight experience where the camera banks with the flight of the drone, while follow will give us the cinematic look as the camera will always stay level. If we jump into the advanced settings, we can tweak how the gimbal operates during flight. Pitch speed regards to how fast the gimbal moves up and down, so a lower value will make it move really slow, while a higher value will make it shoot up and down pretty fast. Under that, where it reads enable upwards gimbal tilt limit to 30 degrees, will essentially allow you to move the camera up towards the sky an extra 30 degrees, so it basically extends the range of motion of the gimbal. Gimbal pitch smoothness deals with the speed that the gimbal comes to a stop and start. So with a value of 0, it will come to an immediate stop, whereas if we bump it up higher, it will take a while to get going and a while to come to a stop. Finally, enable synchronized gimbal pan follow will push the camera in the direction in which the drone is flying. So for example, if I sit here with this setting turned on and I try to spin my drone around to the right, the camera will begin to move with my stick input. If we turn it off, then nothing will happen as I push the stick. The 2 final options on the menu are operations that you can perform to straighten out the gimbal. If you notice that the horizon is tilted in your shots, you can always correct this by tapping Adjust Camera Gimbal. Using the lines provided on the screen, you can move the gimbal back and forth to straighten out your shot. If this still doesn't work, you can always try landing the drone and do a gimbal auto calibration, which can take a minute or so just be patient when doing this. The next settings menu deals with the aircraft's battery, and there isn't a whole lot to change here, but it does certainly give us a lot of important information. We can see the voltage, battery temperature, remaining capacity, total capacity, and the times that the battery has been charged. Under those numbers, we can change our critically low battery warning and our low battery warning. This is when the remote will start beeping at you. Underneath of our current flight time, we can view some advanced settings. So if we want to display the voltage on the main screen next to the battery icon, we can do so. We can also choose the time to discharge the battery during storage. And finally, we can view some details, which really aren't that detailed at all. Moving on, we have the image transmission settings. First up, we can choose our channel mode, which sets up a channel for the drone and remote to operate on together. You can choose auto or custom, and with custom, we get to, of course, select our channel and the transmission quality. I personally would recommend leaving this on auto because having to continue to find a channel with the least amount of noise would be tedious amongst the other things that you need to do while flying your drone. The only other thing that we have on here to choose from is frequency, which is between 2.4 GHz and 5.8 GHz. 2.4 GHz is going to be used for longer range flight in less congested areas with less interference, while 5.8 GHz is used for short range flights where there is interference or just maybe a little bit more interference from other devices like cell phones and routers. I typically always fly with my frequency set at 5.8 GHz so I can get the best transmission quality possible. I really don't do all that much fly far away or long range flights, so again, 5.8 GHz is typically my go-to. Next up, we have our remote controller settings. In here, we can calibrate our remote controller, choose our stick mode, which I don't think you'll be doing a lot of once you get used to a certain set of controls, and finally, we can customize the C buttons on the back of our remote. I usually go with camera forward / down and battery info, although playing around with all of these different options can be useful so that you can find what works for you. Now at the bottom, we can link a remote controller if we get a new one, and we can also view the advanced settings, which essentially just tells you which controller you are using. Getting into the visual navigation settings, these are probably the most straightforward considering all of the writing underneath of each setting, but I'm still going to take some time and go down the list. So at the top, we can turn our obstacle avoidance sensors on or off. These are the sensors that help you avoid crashing your drone into objects. And next, we can enable the horizontal obstacle avoidance in the tap to fly intelligent flight mode, which is definitely a good idea as you don't want your drone flying blind by itself. Next is enable backward flying, which will allow the drone to fly backwards in certain flight modes like active track. This is fine to turn on the Phantom 4 Pro because it has backwards obstacle avoidance sensors, but be careful when using this on the Mavic or Spark, which does not feature the same sensors as the Phantom 4 Pro. Moving down, we can enable obstacle avoidance sensors in active track, which again is good to turn on because you don't want your drone flying blind by itself, and you want to make sure they can avoid any possible obstacles. Now for the final setting on this page, display radar chart is something that displays on the home screen, so essentially it will tell you how close objects are in front and back of your drone. I like turning this on because it reminds me of my car's backup sensor and just adds another layer of protection. Jumping into the advanced settings, these are where things get even more straightforward, but again, we will quickly run down the list. Enable vision positioning turns on the downward VPS, which keeps the drone stable with no GPS connection and makes sure the area is clear to land. Landing protection, again, will be sure that the area is safe when the drone is coming down and landing using the automated return to home feature. Precision landing will try to bring your drone back as close to the home point as possible. RTH obstacle avoidance will check for obstacles during the return to home function. And finally, RTH remote obstacle avoidance will let the drone change its course to safely dodge obstacles when coming back to the home point. As far as all of these settings are concerned, I see no reason to have them turned off as they are very helpful and definitely keep my mind at ease when performing certain autonomous flight modes. The final menu is the main controller settings, which houses some final miscellaneous settings. First up, we can reset our home point, so the first button will set the home point to where the aircraft is currently, while the second button sets the home point to where the controller is currently. This is helpful if you move locations during your flight. Turning on multiple flight modes will gain you access to sport mode and ATTI mode, so if you are just getting your drone and wondering why you can't use sport mode, be sure that this is turned on. Underneath of this, we can set our return to home altitude, which should be evaluated before every single flight, depending on what the obstacles are like around the area that you'll be flying in. Next up, we have some flight restrictions. So first, we can turn beginner mode on and off. So if you want to go ahead and take off those training wheels, this is where that is located. Next, you can set your max flight altitude, and you can also set your max distance if you choose to do so. At the bottom of the menu, we can tap on advanced settings to get into the final menu of the app. Under these settings, we can go and check the status of our sensors such as the IMU and compass, and we can also calibrate both of them, so if you are experiencing any errors, this is the place that you want to check. Now onto our final section titled Other. First, we can choose what happens when our remote controller and drone break connection, either land, return to home, or hover. We can also turn on and off the 2 front LEDs, and we can choose our stop motor method for emergency situations. You can either choose to have this on or totally turn it off. Now, finally, at the bottom, we have ESC beeping. This will make the drone emit a beeping tone, which is quite frankly really annoying, but is very helpful if it has crashed in the woods and you're trying to locate it. You can't visually see it, but therefore you can turn on ESC beeping and you can listen for it.